everybody. How's everybody doing this afternoon? Excellent. Welcome to the Blue Dome. My name is Max Rollinger, the Director of Program Operations for HubWeek. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today for this fantastic panel discussion that we're going to be having. You see all of our speakers up on screen, but it's my pleasure to bring them all up to the stage today. And we'll start off with Jackie McCarthy from CTIA, who's going to be moderating. And just file in where you see your headshot, and we'll get going. Thank you so much, everyone.
Good afternoon. Happy Friday.
So I'm on this end or that end?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Future Forum here at HubWeek. I'm Jackie McCarthy with CTIA, the Wireless Association, moderating this discussion on Boston 2050, urban mobility, driving, and sustainability. Really excited to have this group of experts to talk about how we can get to a more mobile and inclusive and sustainable transportation and energy environment here in our Boston region. So we'll get started. To my right is Mark Yamauchi. He is the Sustainability Manager for Toyota Motors North America. Mark, take it away with some remarks. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me here. It's a wonderful afternoon. Welcome. So again, my name is Mark Yamauchi, Sustainability Manager for Toyota Motors North America. Wanted to just give you a little background. I'm been with the company 32 years, so I've seen the company grow and change quite a bit. And the company's at a really interesting place right now because of the talk about change, as we're all experiencing far more rapid change than we may have had in the past, right? So how do we get in front of and address customers' wants and needs? But what I wanted to bring to your attention is on the slide up on the displays here. How many of you heard? I'm going to ask you two questions. First of all, how many of you believe in climate change? Okay, that's Boston. Okay, of course. How many of you have heard of the 2050 challenge? Congratulations, thank you. We need to give that guy a ride in a Mirai. So let me just take a few moments to talk about the 2050 challenge. The 2050 challenge was established by Toyota globally back in 2015, and it consists of 6 challenges. The first challenge, challenge 1, is to reduce our emissions, vehicle emissions by 90% by 2050. And in order to do that, it takes a multitude of technologies, but we are working on such. Challenge 2 is to have zero carbon, zero emissions for the life cycle of our products. Challenge 3 is zero carbon for all of our facilities and plants and operations globally. Challenge 4 is a water stewardship challenge. Challenge 5 is around materials and recycling and reduction of waste. And challenge 6 is to live in harmony with nature, but is kind of basically the translation works best if you think about it in terms of promoting biodiversity. So this is what guides the company globally from a sustainability standpoint, and is what's helping us move things forward here in North America to be more sustainable and to address the needs of our customers. So we can talk a little bit more about that. You'll see how these challenges and the areas of focus that we have weave into everything we do globally.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Next, we have Barbara Kates-Garnick from the Fletcher School at Tufts. Barbara is a professor of practice at the Fletcher School, and most recently she served as the Undersecretary of Education for Massachusetts, Undersecretary of Energy for Massachusetts, where she was responsible for Massachusetts' implementation of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so, Bobby?
Thank you. Well, welcome. My conversation today is really the confluence of energy and mobility, because these are two issues that are very highly intertwined. As we move into a world of electric vehicles, unless we have clean energy as our supply source, we're making no progress in the issue of climate change, which all of us acknowledge as a major force of our future. So I think it's really important to understand this clean energy and mobility connection as critical. And the way that a lot of this is going to happen is really going to be through technology and the smart grid. And we have a grid configured today, but we really need to see what is the grid tomorrow. And a lot of that has to do with car to grid interconnection. Eventually, EVs will take from the grid, but they will also, at critical times, give back to the grid. There's going to have to be tremendous communication between the grid and car to car. I mean, we are in a totally new world, and cities are going to play a very important role in that as well. So just a few other points as we sort of think about this energy to mobility connection, which is so important. We're going to also have to look at our built environment. We won't have garages in the same way. You won't be going to your gasoline station in the same way. We're going to have to figure out how to deal with battery technology to make it fast charging, to respond to our needs. So there's a lot to discuss as we think about these issues. And the other thing, which is really the tie-in to what Emily is going to talk about, is innovation and entrepreneurship. We are going to be using sensors on our road. We are going to be changing the way that we make decisions based on information. We won't be caught, or hopefully less, in traffic jams. But also, one more thing, there's a lifestyle connection here too. Do we want autonomous vehicles just circling around? We're going to have to figure out how to control our transportation future, and all of that, of course, is very much tied to our energy future and our climate future.
Thanks, Bobby. Next, we have Dr. Emily Reichert. Emily is the CEO of Greentown Labs, which is the largest clean technology accelerator and incubator for startups in the United States, with locations in Somerville and Springfield. So take it away, Emily.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. So glad to have so many in the audience who are interested and have a belief that climate change is a challenge, because I think that that is kind of a fundamental thing that we really all need to agree on to move forward with this conversation. So Mark did a great thing by really highlighting for us what are some of the big challenges, and Bobby started getting into some of how are we technically going to address some of these things. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the other end of the spectrum, perhaps, which is, as Bobby talked about, the innovation and entrepreneurship that's going to get us there. And so what I do at Greentown Labs is support 55 startup companies who are on a daily basis trying to build the technology of the future, and not only build it, but get it to market where it can have a real impact. And that's how we're going to get there. That's how we're going to ultimately solve the problem. So within Greentown Labs, what does it take really to have these companies who are, they're with an idea, they're with a prototype, they're with a vision, get to the point where they can take that vision and turn it into reality? Well, a lot of what we do is really helping to not only provide entrepreneurs with what they need in terms of space, so lab space, for example, wet lab space, places to test things on rooftops, all of those different things. We also provide entrepreneurs with resources and connections that they need to be able to take their technology and get it out into the world. And specifically, that involves bringing together a pool of investors. We work with about 120 of those. We also help companies to think about how to make their product. So we work with about 300 different manufacturers who are based in Massachusetts, because and that's really the reason that we have an office out in Springfield, because that's where a lot of our manufacturing talent is really based in the state. And so we help entrepreneurs think about how to make things. We also help entrepreneurs think about how they can partner. And so a lot of that would be working with companies, large OEMs, like a Toyota, or another partner that's going to help them to build their product towards an actual market that exists and have a pathway to get the product there. So what we do then is provide a lot of different things, either mentorship from large corporations. Also, we provide opportunities to do pilot studies and investments. All of these things we kind of bring together in one place so it's easy for startups to access them. And what we see happen as a result of that is that these companies can raise a lot of funds. In fact, since the founding of Greentown Labs just 5 short years ago, our companies have raised about $260 million, and that's from a variety of both corporate sources, investors, government sources, and they have also created over 900 jobs, and they have been able to have a number of exits, and that is really all about partnering with a large company who's then going to help them take that product to market. So I guess my perspective on all of this is really about the practical aspect of how do you take something that's an idea, and then how do you get it out there in the world where it can make a difference. And so that's the approach that I will take as we go through the panel today. Thank you.
Okay, thanks Emily. Next we have Dr. Julie Newman. Julie is the director of the MIT Office of Sustainability, and her work is at the intersection of decision-making processes and organizational behavior to implement sustainability for higher education. Julie?
Great. Thank you so much. So my role as a director of sustainability is I'm really a sustainability generalist specialist versus a transportation specialist. And I work on, I tend to think of myself in my role, and for those of you in the sustainability field can relate, is we're quite multilingual if we're going to be successful. In other words, we have to work across the board with engineers and architects to behavioral specialists, to innovators, and so on, particularly at MIT, and I work across the board with everybody. And our responsibility, my responsibility particularly at MIT, but those of us in this field need to cut across design and construction, how we think about the design of our buildings and our campuses, to materials management, the flow of materials, how it comes into campus, moves around campus and leaves, our food system, stormwater management and land use, to, of course, more recently, climate mitigation, resiliency, and adaptation, and, of course, transportation, and I think what we're hoping to move away from, parking. So from that perspective, that's the perspective I'll bring to the panel today, is that transit and mobility intersects with and impacts each of these areas. So anytime I'm within a discussion, sorry, can you go back one slide? In a discussion at MIT, we're continuously thinking about transit and mobility across these systems. At MIT, we launched this platform of the Office of Sustainability on a framework of thinking about scales of impact, and we consider all of our work and our sustainability, the way we approach sustainability in the context of the individual, which is clearly we're going to get to today, the campus, again, that's where I'm grounded, the city, and the globe. And when one looks at sustainability in those various intersects, it gives you various lenses and different perspectives on how to then solve for sustainability across those issues. So as a result, all of our efforts in the way we're approaching sustainability from MIT is developing a systems perspective first before we dive into what the appropriate project and implementation mode would be. With regards to transportation, specifically in terms of this introduction, I would just want to share with you 2 angles. So as I mentioned, we're working across all those areas. So when we think about a new model of mobility and moving towards 2050 in a dense urban environment, and in a campus that continues to grow, but our land isn't continuing to grow, just our commitments, our desire for more labs, more housing, that's a big demand. I think something we'll probably get to today as we think about 2050. So just to clarify, what I hope we get to today is how people move to and from and around, and in my construct, the campus. It also may be the city, the home, and how goods move to, from, and around campus. And as we consider this in the panel, I want to make sure we're continuously coming back to that. So for the sake of this discussion, I just want to quickly introduce our MIT short-term approach that may be of interest to you, and something that we've just launched within the past year as we address a growing campus. I always love, this is my third office I've helped launch, and one always walks in, and in my case, I've now approached 3 campuses where they hired me at the same time they were focusing on growth, right? So the role of a sustainability director is to shrink our use, to shrink our emissions, our outputs. At the same time, we're trying to bring more and more people into the system, grow our labs, grow our output. And that's one of the tensions we're going to continue to come across as we think about this move towards 2050. So in the short term, as MIT thinks about growth and increase in demand, what we've put into place today is something that we've just dubbed Access MIT. And it's a broad vision that provides MIT with employees with affordable, flexible, and low-carbon mobility choices. In the short term, we've committed to reduce our demand by 10% in 2 years, and that incremental reduction gives us a chance to study and understand what led to that reduction. We're looking at, again, another topic that we'll get to today is a decrease in campus-based carbon emissions from commuting, and see how that plays into our 2050 vision. As I mentioned, I think it'll be really pertinent to think about, in a dense urban environment like Boston, how do we reduce this demand for future parking infrastructure? And again, one of those tensions as we evolve new types of vehicles. And of course, I think we'll have to continue to think about equity and access. So just a couple of final points here as we think about, go to the next slide. The next component is what we've done is launch a behavioral campaign where we're not only providing access to public transportation as a benefit, but trying to turn one's commute into something they love and really think about how one chooses to move from place to place. So we've moved towards some slogans, and we've had many staff come forward who've actually turned in their parking passes as a result of free access to public transportation. So we're thinking about mode switch, and Access MIT was designed to promote integrated multimodal transportation options for all of our employees, but really designed to promote and leverage flexibility. We were just talking earlier and saying one can go to a place in Boston, you might take the T one direction and take an Uber home. We can really move away from needing to take your car, particularly in this region. And so when we think about, this is meant to just be the model as we, again, this is how can we develop models that can scale across employers, across universities, across municipalities. The last piece I just want to add in terms that I hope to bring to this discussion today, as we think about the role of the campus, not to see that as a bounded model, but higher education in the context of the 2050 model will provide the opportunity to leverage the campus as a model, like we're doing now with our incentive-based programs, and ensuring that we're also providing the research, what worked, what didn't. That in a campus place can lead to not only academic papers, but will create feedback loops, so it really evolves our decision-making process and leads to very informed decision-makings and new models. It will support everything that was mentioned on this panel. We have faculty doing research and innovation on urban mobility. And the last piece, of course, is educating the future generation. So what is it that we want to demonstrate in higher education modules in the context and preparing our future decision makers, leaders, elected officials in the context of preparing for urban mobility of the future. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we can make some more connections. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Julie. Let's dig in a little bit more now to some of the opportunities and also tensions that we identified kind of across transportation, energy, and sustainability. So, Mark, in terms of thinking about the year 2050, about 30 years from now, how will autonomous or electric vehicles kind of change both our infrastructure and how we travel?
Yes, so technology, right? So we're looking at, as I mentioned, multiple forms. Certainly doing a lot of research in autonomous vehicles, but we have to understand that there are various needs from our customers. Some will be met by autonomous vehicles. Some will be met by more mass transit vehicles. It's about providing solutions for a whole multitude of transportation needs. So we have our Toyota Research Institute in 3 locations across the country, right? One out here in Boston, in Michigan, and in Northern California, working on a lot of the autonomous features that we hope to provide to our customers in the future. We're also working on the Prius evolution, Prius Prime evolution, right? Plug-in, battery technologies, fuel cell technologies. You have a chance to ride and drive in a Mirai, which is our hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle. We're also looking at vehicles for mass transit. I don't know if you know, but we are the sponsors for the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo, a major sponsor, right? So we are providing hydrogen fuel cell buses to transport everyone around in Tokyo as part of our technology development, and I can't wait to get them in here. We're also working on material handling fuel cell driven vehicles, as well as car sharing systems. So we're working with several manufacturers or companies, right now, on how we leverage the use of our vehicles. So all the above plays into where we think it will, the automotive industry will be in 2050. But I think the big takeaway is we don't see it as an either-or proposition, right? It's not about electric vehicles or this or that. It is about and. So we really understand that each of those technologies has sweet spots, and we are addressing those sweet spots.
Bobby, you mentioned kind of the nexus of transportation, electricity, and grid infrastructure as being kind of a really important thing to think about when we're thinking about achieving some of these mobility and sustainability goals. And we have a pretty unique mix here of higher education institutions, as Julie mentioned. We also have in our Commonwealth a demonstrated commitment to sustainability. So how should we think about that nexus and about grid interconnectivity as really a driver of these benefits?
I think that is a very critical question for us. And I think one of the things that's important is to think of where we are today and where we're going tomorrow. And I initially had sort of titled my remarks based on the Citgo sign, which is the landmark of Boston in Kenmore Square. The Citgo sign of the future, from gasoline to the smart grid. And I think that's how we really have to look at Boston. It's great to give it landmark status, but where are we going and how are we going to get there? And this energy nexus happens in many different ways. First of all, we have to think about generation. And in Massachusetts, we are committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions very intensely by 2020, which is going to be tough, but we may try to get there. We were trying to get there, and by 2050. So that becomes, I hate the pun, a critical driver of where we're going in this conversation. But then we have to make sure that our grid is able to accommodate change. And one of the things that these hurricanes have shown us is that electricity is the key. So we in New England need reliability, we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to use technology to make us communicate better on the grid, to make it reliable, and also to make it cost effective, because as we know, any energy infrastructure is a huge investment in the future. So this all comes in to the grid of the future, which is energy. It's also the innovation that Emily continues to work on, and we really need to do that. And we also need to change our regulatory paradigms, because we really don't think about this a lot. You know, we see it in terms of government. And finally, how do we encourage partnerships? Because as you know, Toyota has this amazing expertise that we need to connect. They have a vision of the city that government needs to know about. And then, of course, we have to use our labs and our innovations, and that's why Boston is really, and particularly well suited to lead and to think about this mobility energy nexus and really move it to the next step.
Okay, Emily, to kind of pick up on some of Bobby's comments on innovation, and kind of on a related note, kind of culturally or generationally, how do you think we can kind of engage your stakeholders and your sector most effectively to address these challenges?
Yeah, well, I should say that Greentown Labs as an incubator is a place that has 40,000 square feet of space today, and will be growing to 100,000 square feet in a month from now when we open our Global Center for Clean Tech Innovation. And it is filled, for the most part, with a certain population demographic, which is 25 to 35. A lot of these startup founders are, because they come from universities. They enter competitions and accelerators, and once they've raised some preliminary funds, then they end up in the incubator, at which time they start building prototypes, testing prototypes, demonstrating prototypes, finding their first customers and partners. And so they're with us for about 2 years, so we get to know them pretty well. Finally, they graduate out of the incubator and get on their way to being an independent company that is growing. So this population is, I think, and millennials in general, I think, are really the key to the future in so many ways. They get a bad rap often in the press as being the lazy, entitled generation, and I think that is just complete BS from what I see around me every day. And why do I say that? I think this is a generation that has grown up with recycling, this grown up when there were hybrid vehicles on the road. They have a way of asking parents, "Mommy, why did you throw that cup into that bin when it should have been in that bin?" And so you have a generation that is raised with the idea that there are alternative choices, and who uniquely say, and I hear this over and over again, that what I want to do in my career, what I want to do, period, is have a bigger impact. And so I think that these folks are the ones that are going to be driving the changes that we all are going to see around here in 2050. It is going to be driven by a generation that doesn't really need to accumulate as much stuff. They don't need the status symbol car. They're willing to give that up. They want to walk to work. They have a lot of things that they want to do that doesn't necessarily have them living the same life that the previous generations have lived, where they needed a car to get to the suburbs. And so I think the choices that this generation is going to make, and hopefully if this generation votes, which is my one single complaint about millennials, is that we need more voting from them, I think we get on a very good track, both in the sense of climate, also in the sense of just making all of our lives better and more efficient, and spending less time on roads and more time with family, friends, and working productively. So when I look at the choices that folks are making now, millennials can often also be early adopters of technology. They're willing to take risks and try things. And so when I look out at what Boston looks like in 2050, in a funny way, while we have this young generation driving it forward, in a way they're driving us to something that is more like the past. When I travel around the world, mainly to open markets or open connections for startup companies who need markets in Europe or other places, I'm struck by when you're in Copenhagen or you're in some city in the Netherlands, how many different forms of public transportation and cycling and other options are all so easy. And it's because cars have been deprioritized, and bicycles and other modes of transportation that are much more efficient have been prioritized. And so that gets back to, again, the question of voting, the question of prioritizing, and the question of moving towards what makes sense for this generation and what makes sense for all of us, really. And that is moving away from parking cars. It is moving away from driving, 45 minutes or an hour to get to work every day. How can we avoid that? And I think that what we see in Boston in 2050, because we're such a compact city, we have the opportunity to really learn lessons from the past in these larger European cities that are also moving us towards the future when you think about how they're operating. So anyone who is traveling, go and spend some time in Copenhagen and see the piles of bike racks that they have. They just make it so easy. These big bike lanes where there's kids cycling along because they feel like it's safe, because cars have been deprioritized. I think that's where we're headed. And I think in Boston, we're very lucky that our city is compact and we have the opportunity to do that.
Julie, you mentioned kind of the role of academic institutions in these discussions, and in particular how they can bring learnings and findings from research and systemic thinking. When we think about these applications for transportation and energy efficiency and sustainability, can you provide us with some more examples of that?
Sure. I mean, there's so many pieces that interconnect within higher education that were already just mentioned on the panel today. I mean, a couple of pieces that I'll try to weave together. One is around the energy transportation nexus. MIT, but along with many other institutions, are seeking how to achieve goals from, equivalent to our own goal, greenhouse gas reduction goals in Massachusetts. We have a commitment at MIT that seeks to achieve carbon neutrality without a specific date quite yet, because of course we're studying that as to how and when to get there. But I think these are areas that as we're thinking about carbon neutrality, we're thinking of everything that Bobby mentioned, is that what is going to be the demand that we're not yet prepared for from the electrified, in terms of demand from potentially electrified bus and vehicle systems. So we're really trying to toggle with, what do we mean by carbon neutrality? What is the role of transportation, and what is that energy nexus? I think one thing we're really grappling with is this projection that the grid is going to become, decarbonized over time, and again, I guess I'm just trying to emphasize that's all being studied and analyzed within the walls of our institutions. I think a role like mine is to make sure that information doesn't just end up through academic realms, but that as we have incremental results along the way, that can actually inform our own internal strategies. And I think that's the new approach or I'd say the more overt approach that we're starting to develop within higher education. Just trying to tie a couple of other pieces here. I think I had this great example recently where we're talking about the innovation human dimension intersection, where I think higher education can play a better role. And as I'll use Prius as an example, given the connection here. I'm not only a Prius driver, but we have Prius developer right there. But when you look at the algorithm of how a Prius is the mileage a Prius gets, as soon as you start to put a bike rack on top or a car carrier, there's so many dimensions for that Prius to achieve the miles per gallon that it's supposed to get. So part of what we need to do in higher education is be better about understanding that innovation human dimension intersection and be able to articulate it and act on that, if you will. And where I'm going with that is I think the tension we find in higher education is the excitement to jump on whatever the latest technology is, but really trying to make sure that's the appropriate technology. Biodiesel, I think, is a great example where 10 years ago, biodiesel was the excitement on university campuses. They were bubbling out of labs, people were starting to set up biodiesel. But it turned out there were challenges in terms of biodiesel in New England and scalability in this region. So these are the tensions we'll have to continue to figure out and navigate along the way so that we can help cities and households make those decisions as well, if that makes sense. Two other pieces I just want to mention are housing. I think that's something that higher education is going to continue to grapple with, because if those in higher education, if graduate students want to along the line of what Emily was saying in terms of access to the campus, we have to continue, and we're already doing that, grapple with housing at the university level, but clearly in the municipal city level as well, and what do the implications of affordable housing mean for our transit systems. But back to the millennials, I think one of the things that we're now grappling with is, MIT was designed constructed in the site we're in now 100 years ago, and Amazon didn't exist then. I know it's hard to believe. So the amount of deliveries coming to campus, because this generation is used to being able to order, we all are, quickly. I have a 6-year-old who says, can you put that in your cart, right? I mean, the millennial generation, the next generation is used to quick, rapid, I want this, and it's gonna get delivered. And our campuses, and our streets for that matter, weren't designed for that rate of delivery, and that's really starting to influence as we look at the redesign and the update of the redesign of our campuses and the intersection of the campus with the city. We have to be more strategic about thinking about the movement of goods and the rate of goods as a result of the demand of the various generations, but particularly the millennial generation today, and we haven't designed for that rate, as it will. I think I'll stop there. Yeah. The only other, I want to add one other thing that we had talked about before, but that you just brought up was the notion of this cultural piece of growing up in the passage into having a driver's license, right? Who here has a driver's license? And who remembers when you turned, depending upon what state you're in, 16, 15 and a half, 16, I grew up in a state where it was 17, but that was a rite of passage, was into that license. And so I'm intrigued I don't have the answer, but I'm intrigued with what you said as we think about getting to 2050. Does that remain the rite of passage and you're just thinking about an electric car, or is there a new rite of passage in the context of a new urban ecosystem, a new urban system for mobility? What does that look like, and how do we start to construct that today?
Yeah, I think so many of the rites of passage are changing to, the first mobile phone and, all of the applications and access that it gives, a young user. Question for Mark and Emily. How do you think industry, both established firms like Toyota and kind of emerging entrepreneurs, can work effectively with the public sector on recognizing some of these tensions and kind of collaborating and achieving these goals?
So we are lucky to be based in a city that probably most people know, which is right outside of Boston proper, which is Somerville. And one thing that I can tell you is that it really makes a difference what the city's mentality is in terms of experimentation and openness to being kind of a test bed or a demonstration center. We're very lucky to be in a place in Somerville, which is about 2.5 miles from here, where that is a very open option for us. And with the city of Somerville, we've designed a program that's called the Somerville Green Tech Program to enable companies who have technologies that could be tested to do so with the city. So for example, we've had companies put weather stations on school buildings. We've had companies test solar-powered charging stations right outside the T in Davis Square. And so I think cities really have the opportunity when it comes to entrepreneurs. And why this is important for entrepreneurs, because you need to show validation that your technology actually works with the customer. That's what it's going to take you to get the investment big enough that you can grow your company. And so a city is a really great, in a state also, are really great options for being able to do that. And the incentives are well aligned if the city is interested in doing experimentation. And luckily, Somerville is that way. I think Boston is that way. And there are many cities across the country that are that way as well. So I think that the role that cities can play in new technology development is really being a test bed, being open to trying new things out, and being open to, really making the procurement process and other processes that tend to be tough for early stage companies more streamlined, so that they can get their products into a situation that is real world. That's really important for moving startup companies forward. So that's a big role that I see cities playing. Really, they can be test labs for innovation and enable technology to get out into the world faster and often less expensive than if you were to do a pilot in, say, some kind of corporate test lab.
Thank you. So, well put. I think what we're touching on is the infrastructure, right? The infrastructure, when we look at transportation that we all take advantage of every day, it's a system, right? And it's a system composed of many, many parts with many, many stakeholders. And it takes involvement and active participation to move us forward to the future of transportation and transportation infrastructure. We have new technologies come on board. We have to figure out how we support those technologies. We have to figure out how we interact with those technologies. So certainly the governments play a big part of that, but so does the OEMs and the private sector and education. An example, autonomous cars. Whose responsibility is it going to be when you're not driving the car and something happens? If two vehicles want to be at the same place, end up being at the same place at the same time, accident, what happens, right? So there's a lot to be worked out here, and it's going to take a concerted effort by many, many parties, including the government and the cities, to figure this out. And I think one of the things, and a great opportunity, is for cities like Boston to take the lead in that and say, hey, we're looking far ahead. We know what we have now. We know the constraints and opportunities that we have now, but in the future, we see these things happening. How do we address them, and how do we get ready for them? Right. So
can I ask a question to that? So, so the view is that the role of government would be to facilitate and establish rules. But now, how do we make a better connection in all of this with the private sector, with the technology that is coming? How does all of that happen today to get us to tomorrow?
Yes. So I guess all I can say is right now we are trying to work with some very large cities around the world to help them figure out what this means to them in the future. So through the Toyota Mobility Foundation, we've been giving grants to in Japan, in Thailand, in other countries to help them develop their future transportation systems. So again, trying to look at it in terms of the carrot, right? And then start those conversations in terms of, this is what we see coming down the pike. This is what we are concerned with. How do we work together to address these upcoming issues? And again, everyone, we talked about the 2020 Olympics, right? Kind of those marquee events. Everyone wants to acquire because They are, and I know Greenbuild's going to be here in two weeks, in the beginning of November, right? So excited about that for USGBC. But those sorts of events attract cities that are more forward-thinking and understand the situation in terms of what the constraints are now and how they can move forward. So again, it is being able to leverage kind of their knowledge base and the technology and forward thinking to attract businesses and economic growth.
Bobby, in light of the Trump administration's decision to leave the Paris Agreement, and even before that decision was made, there's certainly been an emerging leadership role for states and urban governments in terms of sustainability goals. You were obviously leading that in the previous administration. How do you think, or do you think that these local and regional efforts can really move the needle in terms of achieving climate or climate sustainability and reduction in emissions?
Well, I'm going to say very strongly yes. I think that our lack is, as a country, is a price of carbon. So if we were able to figure out how to price carbon appropriately, and I'm not going to say either a cap and trade or a carbon tax, whatever mechanism, I think that from a national level, that would be a big step forward. In light of that absence of that price in carbon, so much opportunity lies at the local level. And just let me give you, since we are in New England, examples of ways that New England has worked together. Our energy grid is connected. We have a very active ISO New England, independent system operator, that has to make the grid work for all of New England. The Northeast has created something called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is the notion that a whole group of states can figure out actually how to trade carbon emissions in the generation section. The future is going to be a RGGI of transportation. That's a big challenge. Many of the issues of interstate activity, how states are moving toward hydrogen vehicles, electric vehicles, clean fuel standards, and then how you begin to trace all that within a legal framework that allows for interstate commerce. So there's that aspect on the state level as well. 29 states have renewable portfolio standards, which require a certain degree of renewable resources by a certain time. So before the Trump administration, the states and the cities were the movers. And then you have states like Boston, cities like Boston, which are coastal cities. And I think that your state now of Texas experienced a whole series of issues as well. So right now we're in the local, state, leadership opportunity, and I have a feeling that many states will grab that. It's terrible or too bad that we are, moving out of the Paris Agreement, but the future still should be seen optimistically as companies and states work together to know what we know is right and actually what the customer wants as well.
Yeah, and if any of you were in the other dome to hear Mayor Bloomberg speak, you'll know that he announced that even in the absence of our formal participation in the Paris Agreement, we're on pace as a nation with cities, states, and private industry to meet the substance of the goals of that agreement. Emily, we were talking a bit about this question about kind of city and local efforts and whether they can make a difference. What's your view on that?
So I think it's important to know, and again, in the context of what's happening federally, that cities can play an incredibly important role. So they make up about 75% of the global greenhouse emissions that our Earth is currently dealing with. 75% of GDP and 50% of the people in the world all live in cities. So it's not insignificant to imagine that if cities can take the lead, a lot of impact can be had in the context of climate. I think that what I've seen since the Trump administration made the decision to get out of the Paris Climate Agreement is really a lot more activity and a lot more excitement and a lot more people talking to one another across cities than happened before that. There's people that are making pledges to do things like become 100% renewable, meaning cities pledging to do that. There are all kinds of commitments that are being made. Now, measuring them and making sure that people follow up on those commitments is kind of a different topic for another day. But the point is that there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm and excitement in people talking to each other that wasn't happening before we had this opposing force, so to speak, to deal with in terms of moving our clean energy economy forward. And I know in my context, just the number of people that are talking to each other, through clean technology incubators, through advocacy organizations that used to only care about the Bay Area, or only care about Boston, or only care about Washington, D.C., are now all talking to each other. And when a big program like ARPA-E or something related to transportation is at risk in a federal budget, suddenly all of these groups are working together. And that wasn't happening before. So I think that while what's happening at the federal level is discouraging, it is not a cause for giving up hope towards our clean energy future, because there is just so much activity and so much momentum, and now there's so much passion towards just fighting for the cause that we really stand to make a lot of progress, almost in spite of what's going on at our federal level. The other thing to know is California is going to do what California is going to do. They're the 8th largest economy. Europe is moving forward fast on clean energy. And China, I mean, when you talk about transportation and what the potential there is, I think recently Beijing announced that every 5th car would be an alternative fuel car as of 2021 or 25. So these things are happening in other parts of the world, and everyone needs to respond to that. And so there's market forces that are going to drive this forward. So I think there's a cause to worry, but there's also a lot of energy and excitement and enthusiasm to be reassured by.
Julie or Mark, other thoughts on kind of this, urban and city-based leadership and the inclusion of academia and private sector?
I mean, I see exactly what Emily's saying. I mean, the amount of engagement that's taking place in the higher education sector. And in fact, right now, one of my colleagues from my office is speaking at a conference at a meeting at Yale that's trying to strengthen city-university partnerships on all things climate, urban mobility. So I agree. I guess what I'm trying to, maybe there's a question back to the panel that I've been pondering is how do we continue to emerge and strengthen the relationships that we're speaking about? There's individual connections that we can make across universities and cities and decision makers. But what I've been thinking through at the same in the same context is what are those subnational? What are the strongest kind of subnational models we can continue to create so that as policymakers are thinking about putting pressure, or seeing opportunities for what the leverage points are at this level, then we can continue to react at the local level. So that's what I've been pondering was how do we continue to communicate? Like if we anticipate that hydrogen vehicles are going to become actually scalable, how do we start planning for that now? What are the leverage points at the policy realm? What are the design standards and so on? So I think that's where I want to put it back to the team maybe here is, what are those ideal partnerships given the varied representation that we have on the panel here?
Okay, so I have to say, so the 2050 challenge, getting back to that, right? The current administration has no effect on where we are going. This is a business imperative for us, right? So Just saying. So, but seriously, we find this very important to us and to all of y'all. See, my Texas just came out. But speaking of tech, I want to just get back to one thing. So rite of passage, right? I have just coincidentally, I get my Texas driver's license next week. So, but anyway, getting back to on point here. So how do we move this forward? Again, we are very much focused in providing products that meet y'all's needs, right? So, call to action, Prius, and alternative fuel vehicles. You know, the demand needs, we need to work together to make sure that demand's there so we can build products and move in that direction, right?
I think that's a great example where I think panels like this, I'm sure there's many in the audience here, the role of higher education in partnership, we have to be able to talk more openly about what these tensions are moving forward, right? So at one level, we have these individual demands for new types of vehicles, low emission vehicles, and then at the same time, we're talking about systems and the nexus between transportation infrastructure and a low carbon future. And we're all grappling with this, and I think we have to continue to build the language in a way that we can, again, better understand what the future is that each of us are thinking and where those intersections are, so we're planning them together, if you will.
And I think we need to get a little bit more concrete on what a lot of this means, because the market will speak. I think that's what, you just essentially said, that it's your customers that are making these demands. And, people in government are designing policy, so we're taking out the federal government at this moment. And then you have to say, well, who are the other components of these decisions? And, of course, I see the world very much through the energy lens. And how do we, in time, design the technology and the future to get this all together? And I think that the amount of dollar of investment needed is intense. It's large. And for me, it's really the putting it together in many respects that's the challenge for us. And that I think that's part of the next part of the conversation that we need to have.
Bobby, I noticed in your bio that you also served in leadership at a U.S. utility, and you were also a public utility regulator. So what's your outlook on the role of the utilities in that discussion?
Again, to me, what we're talking really about is the grid. And you could look at this in many different ways. So let's just take EV charging. One is obviously making sure that the customer is able to get fast charging. You need to make sure that happens. But then you need to say, okay, what is the pricing of that charging? Is charging going to be free, or how are we paying for it? So are we just going to make it into a gasoline station type of approach, which is, I think, really where many of us see it going. But again, ultimately, it's being electricity from the grid. How is it being priced? What is the time of day? Am I going to get a different price if I'm charging in a garage at night? What about the cost to my home? Am I paying the residential rate? Could I be paying a different price? So again, these are the devil in the detail kind of conversations that we constantly need to be having and evolving, as the technology evolves and as the market evolves, and as Emily's young entrepreneurs bring us new ways of thinking at it. So I think it's a combo, but we really need to get at it more quickly than we may be.
Okay. Any other questions or thoughts before we take it to the audience for Q&A?